So my journey discovering the Shekinah actually starts in a Hindu ashram, which was the first place I was introduced to the idea of the Godhead as both masculine and feminine, specifically Shiva and Parvati, and they are the great cosmic movements of destruction and creation. Shiva with the destruction and Parvati with creation. And so I began to resonate with this idea that there was this balance that was masculine and feminine. And later in the Gnostic material, I discovered Sophia being paired with the Christ. And it didn't sound too strange to me because I had had that experience at the ashram. And then I discovered the Shekinah. She comes to us from the Jewish mystical tradition, as I mentioned, and is by far the most well-developed picture we have of the divine feminine in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Because she comes out of the mystical tradition, she was not well known probably until the 20th century because it was closely held teaching. You had to be a man and you had to be over 40 years old, certainly married, have studied Torah for many years before you could begin to learn the mystical tradition in general and the teaching about Shekinah in particular. And even today, I've attempted to talk to rabbis who have their own congregations about Jewish mysticism. A lot of it isn't even taught in the seminaries. I'm not sure they call them seminaries, where rabbis are trained. And so it has some popular understanding now. Most famously, I think Madonna got into it at some point. But it's known a bit, I think, more popularly than it actually is even known in general in the mainstream Jewish tradition today. So in the mystical tradition of Judaism, there are three great innovations that they bring to the understanding of the divine. The first is this idea of a transcendent God who is completely unknowable, about whom nothing can be said. So far more than the transcendent God I learned about in catechism as a young Catholic girl, but something that is completely outside of creation. And then God emanates down through a number of levels of cosmic awareness, you could say, until you reach the bottom level. I'm going to quickly show you a diagram. I don't usually have pictures that I bring up here, but when we get to talking about Shekinah more after Easter, I will probably post a very large version of this. This is the Kabbalistic tree of life. It's a map of God. What happens is Ein Sof is up here, right above this, and at the very bottom, we have the place where we humans can actually connect with the divine, where we have what we call the immanent face of God, and that is Shekinah in the tradition. So she resides in this it's the lowest circle, it's called the Sephirot. So in this tradition, what we can really experience is much more that feminine presence. However, that tree of life is completely equally balanced between masculine and feminine. One side feminine, the other masculine. It becomes very complicated, which is why I have refrained for 3.5 years from talking about this particular tradition as much as I love it and as much as it speaks to me. And we'll see when we delve into it after Easter how we do with that. In order to get to the real juicy stuff, there's a certain amount of technical material that we do have to go through. So we had Ein Sof, and we have this idea of Sophia, the masculine and feminine principles, and this tree of life, the way God emanates down to us. The other innovation that we find in Kabbalah is that God needs us as much as we need God. And so we are here to partner with the divine in the work of creation. So creation in this tradition is still unfolding. In fact, there are some rabbis in the tradition who actually talk about the fact that we're still in the 6th day of creation, because it's still unfolding. And we are part of that unfolding, and where creation breaks, we are part of the repair. It's called Tikkun Olam. And actually, during our series in Lent, Naki is going to touch on that. Our series in Lent is going to be about lamentation. And there's a piece of that is related to that. So, who is this Shekinah, and what does she bring to us? She is called the bridge between the worlds, because through that emanation of God down to where we can discern God, she is the driving force. So when they talk about a bridge across the worlds, they're talking about this feminine principle. She's indwelling. The term Shekinah actually means God dwells among us. Shekan is a verb that means to dwell. And so it is the divine presence that dwells here with us. Before the second temple was destroyed, she was said to reside in the temple at Jerusalem, and when it was destroyed, she goes into exile with the Jewish people. And because the Jewish people and humanity in general is still in the state of exile, she dwells among us and remains with humanity. She also brings protection and presence during times of suffering and sickness. I have mentioned her, when I've mentioned her at all, as the presence of God on the battlefield, in the places where there is great destruction, that she is also there. And there is mythology in Kabbalah about the lost, it's called the lost sparks. It's these bits of divinity that are lost in matter here in creation, and hers is the force that raises all of those bits of divinity back up and makes the divine presence whole. And so there's also this sense in which she doesn't just create, but she brings together and maintains all of creation. And she embodies time and space. So Shekinah, you don't see the word in the Bible at all. You see it first in some Jewish commentary in about the 3rd century. But once this began to be developed, the rabbis looked back and they started right there in Genesis with this hovering presence, this ruach, the breath of God, hovering over the primordial waters. And it's at this point that space and time really begin to unfold out of those primordial waters. And so she represents first movement and therefore also time. And so they look back to creation, a little bit like the Sophia we talked about last week, who was there present at creation, prior to and then present. It's a somewhat similar idea that she is there before time and space begin to unfold. The other thing about Shekinah that I just want to touch on briefly is that she has a form both lower, the form that we can relate to, and something called the upper Shekinah. And so what this whole idea of a world that is still broken is about is that the Shekinah that we can touch will one day return to the Godhead, and creation will be perfected and healed and whole. And so she's also that movement that will result in that. And that's where I'm going to leave it, because it gets really complicated after this, if that wasn't complicated enough. And what we'll do is probably spend a fair bit of time talking about Kabbalah and this mystical tradition, probably starting somewhere in April, and really begin to delve into the theology that accompanies this idea of the Shekinah, the divine feminine. She isn't just there because there's this idea of whether it needs to be balanced. That's true. But there are also other theological principles that are tied to her very closely.